Harry Lenga was living in Warsaw when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939. Mr. Lenga escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941. We will now hear about his story from his son, Scott Lenga. This is a special story to me because in 1986, the first Holocaust survivor that I ever heard speak was Harry Lenga. Personal testimonies like his of genocide and survival compelled me to study and then to teach Holocaust history and literature. Harry Lenga, who passed away in the year 2000, was one of 3 brothers from Poland who survived the Shoah by using the watchmaking skills that they learned from their father. After the war, Harry built his life and family in St. Louis, where he began speaking about his experiences in the Shoah. His speeches at St. Louis area schools had a powerful impact. His listeners loved him for his warmth and openness. Excerpts from Harry's extensive testimony are prominently featured in our museum exhibits. Scott Lenga grew up here in St. Louis and now lives in Israel, where he built a family and works as an attorney in the high-tech industry. We are very excited about Scott's new book, The Watchmakers, which tells the full story of Harry and his brothers, the life and death risks they took to stay together, and how they fought to survive.
I come to you standing on the shoulders of my dad, Giel Lenga. He and his brother Moshe changed their names to Harry and Morris when they settled in St. Louis after the war. In the 1980s, long before there was a Holocaust Museum in St. Louis, my dad was among the first survivors to speak in schools all over Missouri. I am deeply grateful to Sister Vida Prince and Rabbi Robert Sternberg, who interviewed my dad, encouraged him to speak out, and joined him on stage at countless school assemblies. Though I now live in Israel, I grew up in U City and Olivet, a short couple of miles from the site of the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. Many thanks to the museum staff for inviting me to speak at this commemoration of Yom HaShoah. It is a big honor for me to be addressing the St. Louis community. My dad grew up in the 1920s and 30s in a family of watchmakers in Kuznets, a small town in Poland with deep Hasidic roots. Their life before the war was tough. His mother died in childbirth when he was just 4 years old, and his family fell into a cycle of poverty that they could never get out of. He had a tough relationship with his father. My grandfather, Zaidi Michoel, who I never met, was strict and impatient with his kids. He was devoted to the Hasidic way of wrestling with his own hardships in life. On many days, when his family literally had nothing to eat and not even enough money to buy a loaf of bread, he would look hunger and poverty in the face and give away his last few coins to someone who walked into his store begging for charity. He told his kids that God would provide. Zaidi Michoel thought that he was teaching his children to walk the truth path of spirituality, but it was too much for them. My dad would run outside and cry silently. Zaidi Michoel wanted his sons to become Torah scholars and didn't push them to learn the watchmaking trade. But when they came to his watchmaking bench with their own initiative, he was patient and encouraging. He taught them by example the patience and focus required for the precision work. At the time, they didn't know how valuable this watchmaking skill would be for them. And it wasn't until later in the war when my dad finally understood how his father's religious discipline trained him and his brothers to sacrifice for each other and to help others in the most extreme situations. 3 years into the war, on September 26, 1942, at around 6 o'clock in the evening, Zaidi Michoel's friend, the captain of the local Polish police, came to tell him that the Germans had planned to round up all the Jews of the town the next morning and to send them away on a train. He told Zaidi Michoel that if he loved his sons, he should make sure they escape by 8 p.m. that evening. Here are several interview clips where my dad describes the heart-wrenching scene that followed.
All 3 of us, we left the first day of Sukkot in the evening. We knew that the next day will be for sure the deportation. And of course we asked my father again to go with us, and he didn't. Of course, one thing is it was involved. It was my mother, my stepmother, my father, and her sister stayed with us, and the mother. So my mother said she won't leave her mother. Her sister said she can go away leave the mother with her sister. My father said, I can go away, leave my wife with her mother. And that's how it was. One felt responsible for the other person. But all of them agree that we three should leave. Let's take a chance. Because we didn't know what's going to happen. But he said, let's take a chance. And you know what my father did? Everything, what he had. He took everything together and he packed everything and he gave it to us. He knew we are going away to that camp. I says, Dad, you can't give us everything, the tools and watches and rings, whatever we had. And he says, I don't need it. You have a chance, you're still young. No matter what will happen to me, we won't be able to use that. But you're young, you might have a use for it. So you take it and keep it. We bought our lives many times because of that.
My father was seeing to that we are leaving. He was very serious about it, We cried. Each of us cried. My father cried. I cried. My brother cried. Marcel and Moshe. My mother cried. We all cried. We walked out. We kissed each other. We ran to each other, embraced, and we kissed each other, and we walked out from the house. My father was praying to God we should make it to the place. We shouldn't be caught by the Germans.
Because that was a big risk too.
Sure, you shouldn't supposed to leave the ghetto. We had to go outside the ghetto. And that was the end of it. In the morning they took all them away and they were finished. They took them to Treblinka.
The next morning, the Lenga brothers stood with my dad's best friend, Chamira Salzberg. Chamira described the scene as follows. Suddenly, there was heard in the camp the whistle of a locomotive. A special train with many cars had carried away our dearest and most beloved on Sunday, September 27th, 1942. To this day, the whistle of a train remains for me a nightmare. All were strongly affected by the horrifying news. Many collapsed. Some hours later, my dad's family, along with the 10,000 Kozhenitzer Jews, more than half of the population of the town, arrived in Treblinka, where they were herded into a single gas chamber and murdered with industrial efficiency within a matter of minutes. The watchmaking tools that the three Lenga brothers received from Zedi Michoel were literally tools of survival in the slave labor camps of Gorchitsky, Volanov, and Starchowice. At the same time, those tools were a kind of amulet, a vital emotional connection to their father, a physical link to his tears and prayers. The brothers made a pact to stay together no matter what happened and at any cost. And when those precious tools were taken away from them on the ramp in Auschwitz, along with their clothes, all of their body hair, and even their names, when the numbers A19366, A19367, and A19368 were tattooed on their arms, my dad described their response as follows. We knew that our hair would grow back and that the numbers were tattooed on our arms, not in our minds. But losing our watchmaking tools left us completely naked. Right away, I made a screwdriver by grinding the end of a nail. Then I made a tweezer from the spring in an old pair of earmuffs. I also found a little toothbrush that I could use to clean watch bars. There were so many plundered watches in Auschwitz. The Germans would trade those watches with each other inside the camp. The Block Altister, the foreman in our barrack, was a Polish guy. He also got a hold of broken watches somehow, and we fixed them in his office after work. With those few tools, I could take apart a watch to clean it and put it back together. Of course, I couldn't fix a watch that needed a new part. When that happened, I told him the watch could not be fixed and asked if he would let me have it for the parts. He agreed, and soon we had 4 watches for ourselves in Auschwitz. 4 times they traded a watch to stay together, and 4 times that saved their lives. Watchmaking was like an ark that carried the 3 brothers through the deluge of war and moral chaos. The mechanical watch itself is a powerful symbol of culture, refinement, civilization, a creation of man that strikes the perfect harmony between the force of gravity, the rotation cycle of the earth, and the very human construct of time. By contrast, the Nazi oppressors in the camps were on the vanguard of a systematic descent into moral depravity, a monstrous deconstruction of Western civilization. And here was my dad, This skinny, starving Jew with a nail and an earmuff spring, proving that even here there is still hope, that we can fix a watch, and maybe even what it symbolizes. The Lenga brothers were liberated from the Ebensee concentration camp in Austria on Sunday, May 6, 1945. My dad weighed 75 pounds, and his brother Moshe weighed 70 pounds. Their liberators were U.S. Army tank commanders Bob Persinger and Dick Pamonte. Bob Persinger commanded the Lady Luck tank. My dad never knew their names, but said he would never forget their faces. My dad loved the American GIs. He said, you could feel the freeness in them, all over them, and the way they talked. No fear. That made a big impression on me. I really felt free with them. Little did he know that Bob Persinger lived in Rockford, Illinois after the war, just a few hours up the road from our home in St. Louis. I would like to take a step back and reflect on our current moment in history, when almost all of the survivors have passed from this world, and the responsibility falls to guys like me, the second generation, and my kids, the third generation. We need to ask ourselves, why? Why do we continue to tell individual survivor stories? Why do we continue to tell the larger story of the Holocaust? There are many good answers to these questions. I will offer the following thoughts. Nazi ideology elevated racism and the will to power over human conscience. They made it into a guiding philosophical principle that human conscience itself is a weakness to overcome. It was more than an ideology. It was a type of religion. The Nazis were very explicit in targeting the Jews as a perennial symbol of human conscience in European culture. Jewish guilt, if you will, that had infected Europe with Judeo-Christian values. They defined Jews as a race that needed to be exterminated for Germany to achieve their true destiny as 20th century barbarians of the master race. As Hitler declared in 1933, we are barbarians. We want to be barbarians. It is an honorable title. The Nazis were able to take power in the most technologically advanced country in Europe and take this conscience is weakness principle to a hideous extreme that we now call the Holocaust. We now live in a time of great fear and confusion regarding core values and even facts. The so-called culture wars are only one facet of this problem. Neo-Nazi movements have exploited this fear to increase their visibility. Their views are being normalized in larger populations who are not even true believers in Nazi ideology. It has been said that when the Nazis came to power in Germany, 1/3 supported them, 1/3 opposed, and 1/3 passively waited to see what would happen. These numbers teach us a critical lesson, that evil people with genocidal agendas depend on the passive ones to shrug their shoulders and look the other way. And the fate of a country, and sometimes even the fate of the world, is determined by the passive ones. As second and third generation survivors, we didn't exactly apply for this job, but this is our moment in history, our opportunity to fix something. Our mission in teaching the Holocaust is to stand on the shoulders of the survivors and scream from the rooftops that each individual is important, precious, created equal in the image of God, and that conscience is the core of our humanity. The Holocaust is an example for the Jews and for all of humanity to see what can happen if we allow ourselves to forget this. The consequences can be swift and extreme. Unimaginable evil on an unimaginably huge scale. I will close with a wish that I and my fellow second and third generation survivors are able to fulfill this mission with optimism and passion. We can't allow ourselves to lose heart. My dad speaks powerfully to this point.
The only thing is a miracle. We hope for a miracle. That's all. So we used to say we are still alive. A miracle can happen a minute from now, a day, an hour, you understand, a day, a week, a month, and let's want to keep on going. Because maybe it'll happen in our time before we are finished off. You know, sometimes you can talk yourself to something you believe in it too. You're up for it, you know. A lot of people are hungry people. And they believed that I'm hungry now, but later I'll find something to eat. He can last longer than the one, you know, don't think that way. Thinks I'm hungry and I won't get any more food. He becomes a pessimist. He dies faster.
You saw it happen.
Yeah, I did see. Yeah, and many times when they gave up, you know, boys gave up. They said it's pointless. Pointless, he said, to destroy more and more and more. Give up, we will never come out alive. You know, he was a pessimist. And that is a terrible sickness, pessimism. You destroy yourself. I know that it's possible. You have to have optimism all the time.
In this context, the renewed and redoubled efforts of the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum to deliver this message to the Jewish community and the larger community of the Midwest gives me hope and strength. Thank you.